Hi. What we're going to speak about this morning is actually three areas of the Siddur. We're going to start out asking a simple question. What's the purpose of the Haftarah? I mean, what is it, a half a Torah? What's the Haftarah? How does it work? That's the first question. And there are a couple of theories. The theory we're going to touch upon this morning is that of the Avudurim. Rabbi David Avudurim was a late Spanish Rishon, probably one of the primary sources of anyone who does a commentary on the Siddur. We go to the Avudurim because of the fact that he was a Rishon, a very authoritative source. And he presents the following as a theory, that really there was only Kriyas HaTorah. Where did the Haftarah start? If we could go back to the terrible decrees, to quote the Rambam, Gazru Gezeros, the various decrees that the Greco-Syrians imposed upon the Jews living in Israel. And what were some of those? You're familiar, because it was these various series of decrees that ultimately led to the insurrection that we call the Hanukkah story. They prohibited, for instance, the lunar calendar. Can you imagine Judaism without a lunar calendar? How do you observe the holidays? They prohibited circumcision. They viewed it as something which was, debasing the human body. The circumcision is the very sign of the covenant that we have. It goes back to the historical covenant with Avram Avinu. It's the demarcating factor of a Jew. They prohibited the Shabbos, the Sabbath observance, because the Shabbos is what shapes and defines the Jewish community in the Jewish relationship with God and with each other. On the Har HaBayis, they went in, and there's a point called the Soreg. The Soreg, as you know, on the Har HaBayis, the Temple Mount, there's a place for all of humanity. To quote King Solomon when the first Beis HaMikdash was built, Ki beisi beis tefillah yikarei l'chol ha'amim, for all peoples, for all nations. But on the Temple Mount there are mechitzos, there are boundaries, and the Soreg is the boundary that at that point, Gentiles are welcome to that point. At that point on, only Jews go. And they broke through, partsu protzos, they broke through in 13 different places at the Soreg. Just parenthetically, in the Turkish Museum, we have actually some of the Soreg from the Roman destruction of the Beis HaMikdash in 70 of the Common Era. We have a couple of pieces of the Soreg, and it says in Latin, it says in Greek, it says in Aramaic, that all are welcome, but beyond this point, only Jews can go. What happened? You're familiar with Vehamidu Tselem Behechal. After they broke through the Soreg, they ended up putting idols, into the very Heichal where only the Kohanim could go. So what did they do? They trashed, they perverted, they corrupted the central national Jewish institution, the educational institution of the people, the Beis HaMikdash. So Shabbos, the Jewish calendar, which is the holidays, which is our whole life, as families, as a community, the Bris Milah, the circumcision, the national institution, the educational institution of the Beis HaMikdash, and as well, probably the most famous, is what did they do? They prohibited Jewish education. You're familiar with the concept of the dreidel? What's spinning the dreidel on Hanukkah? What does that have to do with anything? The dreidel was a subterfuge. The fear is that it would be Hellenistic Jews that would hear the Jewish educators working with the youth, educating them, preparing them, and that they would they would rat them out to the Greco-Syrian authorities. So there's a subterfuge. Whenever someone walked by, they played with the dreidels. Now, what was one of the things that took place in the years leading up to the rebellion, leading up to the Hashmonaim revolting against the Greco-Syrians? What the educators did was they went to the Greco-Syrian authorities and said, look, you prohibited Jewish education. What we're asking is the following. We'd like to read, instead of the Torah with the Targum, which is an translation that is a perush, a translation that explains and brings the Torah Sheba'al Peh into the Torah Shebechsav, that they weren't allowed to do. We'd like to read from the prophets. And as you know, one of the 13 principles of Judaism is Ein Navi Rashoy L'Chadesh Davar. No prophet can teach or add anything to the Torah after Moses. Meaning what? The role of the prophets is to get the people to live an ethical and moral life, to exhort the people, to encourage them, how to take care of the weak in society, how to be charitable. The role of the prophets is to strengthen people's observance and their commitment and their integrity, and not to be hypocritical. And the Greco-Syrians were okay with that. because they were looking for an ethical, moral society. They didn't want to see a hypocritical Jewish people. And they said, okay, that's something we'll allow. But that very act of instituting the Haftarah, what did that do? You know what that did? It took the theme of Parshas HaShavua, and think about Jews across the world. Before the Lublina Rav Meir Shapiro, instituted the Daf Yomi, what was the one thing that united all Jews educationally? Parshas HaShavua. Everybody studied and learned and prepared amongst themselves individually in his groups and then as a community together in shul. Everybody studied the same parsha of the week. And it was like the fulcrum of Jewish education. Well, what this did was it maintained it, because they always took a section of the Navi that related to the Sidra, that related to the Parshat HaShavua. I'll give you a simple example. Parshas Naso. What's the Haftarah? It's the story of Shimshon. It takes the concept of the Nazir, what is a Nazir, and what are the objectives of abstention from wine and removing oneself from association with death, and also dealing with the aesthetic, the hair growing long. What is this idea? What is the whole theme of the Nazir? And it took that principle that was studied that week, which could no longer be studied because of the Greco-Syrian Gezeros, and it took that theme and it discussed it, and it projected it forward. And the Haftarah is always linked to the Parsha unless there's a primary link. For instance, if it's a certain time of year, if it's associated with the time of year of a certain holiday. So then it takes the themes and the principles of that holiday, and it discusses them, analyzes them. So the concept of communal Jewish education was maintained through this legal loophole, through this legal subterfuge of the Haftarah. According to the Avudurim and his theory, after 163, after the insurrection, 163 before the Common Era, and the Chashmonaim are successful, and once again we have religious freedom and religious tolerance, we can re-engage in Jewish education, we can reinstitute Parshas HaShavua with the Targum, they clean up the Beis HaMikdash, and once again it's the seat of the Sanhedrin in the place which unifies all Jews for the purposes of Jewish education, and we observe Bris Milah, etc., etc. So now you don't have a need for the Haftarah, right? We're back to the real McCoy, the Parsha with the Targum, the real Kriyas HaTorah. It was at that point the Sanhedrin said, no, we're going to keep it. We're going to make it part of the experience every Shabbos, every holiday. We're going to make it eternally part of that experience. Why'd they do that if it wasn't necessary? So the answer is what? It's a historical statement. It's a statement that we make every Shabbos, every Yom Tov, every fast day. That what? That we acknowledge, that we, so to speak, stand up and express our historical gratitude for their Mesiras Nefesh, for the fact that they did whatever they could to continue Jewish education, to the continuance of our value system, our philosophical value system, our legal value system, through this system of instituting the Navi, instituting the Haftarah. It's our historical debt of gratitude, and it's also our historical statement every week that we acknowledge Mesiras Nefesh and the value of Mesiras Nefesh for something above and beyond our own parochial needs, our own individual needs. And what is that? For the principle and the system of Jewish education. That's why we read the Haftarah, says Rabbi David Avudurim. That's his theory. And this idea you see two other times in the Siddur, twice in what we'll call our prayer service. One manifestation is something that you only see on a Shabbos, in a Yom Tov, where there's a Musaf. The other is a manifestation we see each and every day. So what's number two? Number two is the following. You ever wonder why in the Musaf Kedusha we say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad? What's the Shema do? Shema is a philosophical declaration. It's a declaration of who we are, of what our relationship is to this universe, what our relationship is to God, how we understand God is insofar as a human being can understand God, right? Hashem is Elokeinu, He's our master. He's the master of this universe. Elokim, from the sense of created the sciences, a system of general providence, how He runs this universe. There's a system, there's a judgment, Elokim, Elokeinu. And what? Hashem is Echad. He's also a God of Rachamim, but who is a complete unity. His oneness, His uniqueness, His unity is different than anything else that we know. So we acknowledge, again, our relationship to God, our relationship to the system of this universe, and our notion of God. It's a philosophical statement. What's that doing in Kedusha? Kedusha is Shevach. It's praise. It's acknowledgement of what God is. It's our experience of Shevach. What are we putting Shema there for? And by the way, if you're going to have it in the Kedusha of Musaf, so how come it's not in the Kedusha of Shacharis? It's not in the Kedusha of Mincha? Why specifically Musaf? So this idea, and the next idea that we'll get to, I saw Rabbi Wolgemuth, who was a great Rav. He was a survivor, a German Jewish survivor, who was one of the Rebbeim in Maimonides. When Rabbi Soloveitchik started in Boston, the day school Maimonides, the Rambam day school, one of the first yeshivas in America, it was this Rabbi Wolgemuth. And as well as being a regular Rebbe, he taught a shiur to the 8th graders and to the 12th graders in the Siddur, so they would understand the value of tefillah, the meaning of tefillah, the great Jewish philosophy that comes from tefillah, and the ability to communicate with the Ribono Shalom, the ability to have a real relationship with God. And what happened? That was the one requirement. You couldn't graduate 8th grade elementary school unless you graduated Rabbi Wolgemuth's class in tefillah, and you couldn't graduate high school. You didn't get a diploma unless you graduated or passed the shiur in 12th grade. Okay? If you look up, if you Google Rabbi Wolgemuth, they turned it into a book, into a sefer in English, which was really some of the notes and some of the ideas that he taught in his course. So these two ideas are acknowledged, are stated in this sefer. Take a look at the epilogue where he says them in the name of the Rav. What's Shema Yisrael? What's it doing there? So when you and I know that in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt, when one of the things that was done to the center of the country was they plowed it over, acres and acres were plowed over by hundreds of tons of salt. Okay? Now what happens there? The only place a Jew can live is in the north. That's really the only place a Jew can live, is in northern Israel. Well, most of the Jews in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt, in the aftermath of the Hadrianic decrees, the religious persecutions, and as a function of the terrible economy and the difficult times just to support a family, at the end of the 2nd century, the beginning of the 3rd century, the Common Era, most Jews leave Israel and migrate to where? To what we call Bavel, today's Iraq, the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And the great Jewish communities, diaspora communities, emerge in Bavel. Okay? We're familiar with Sura, Pumbedisa, Narda, Masa Machasya, many of these great cities. What happens? There is a community, a minority community in northern Israel. They're not under the rule of the Zoroastrians and the Parthians like the Jews living in the diaspora in Bavel are. They're under the rule of the Byzantine Christians. Because again, the empire, the Roman Empire becomes the Holy Roman Empire, becomes a Christian empire. And it splits into two parts. There's Byzantium, the Eastern Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox come out of that. You've got the western part of the empire, that's Roman Catholicism. But the Byzantines, that eastern part of the empire, they control Israel. And they're very difficult, and they're very brutal to the Jewish community. And as Christianity ascends politically, and as it ascends in terms of power, they take out their wrath and their animus on the Jewish community. And what do? They take the most Jewish verse in the whole Bible, the most Jewish verse in the whole Torah, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which we said is our statement of the unity of God. It's our statement of the uniqueness of God. It's our statement of monotheism. What do? They twist it and pervert it, and they use that as a source for the Trinity. Hashem, Elokeinu, our master, referring to the carpenter of Nazareth, Hashem, the Holy Spirit. They take those three ideas. They take the words, and they literally manipulate, pervert, bastardize the words of the holiest verse, of the verse of Shema Yisrael, and they turn it upside down and make it as a support for the Trinity. All three together make up Echad. That's the heresy that they have. And what happened? They were so threatened, and they were so upset that the Jews would publicly call out Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, for just the opposite, for its real meaning, talking about the oneness, the uniqueness, the oneness of God, the unity of God, not the Trinity. That they prohibited us from declaring Shema Yisrael in our shuls. They banned it, and they put sentries, guards that would stay there knowing when it was said in the prayer service and prohibited it. When did they do this? Initially, they did this on Shabbos, because when are there more people in shul? People are not going to work on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and they would come. And that's when they would send the guards. And they would post guards at these synagogues throughout northern Israel and the Galilee and the Golan Heights, etc. So what did the Jews do? They said it privately at home, early in the morning before coming to communal worship, before coming to Tefillah B'tzibor. And then after the Amidah, when it was already past the time for Shema, it was already past the time for Shacharis, they're on to Kriyas HaTorah, then the guards would leave. What would happen? The Jews would say it when they took out the Torah after the guards had left. The Jews would say it in the Musaf of Kedusha. Why? Because they wanted the opportunity, B'tzibor, to be Mekadesh Hashem's name Birabim, to declare the true, so to speak, knowledge of the Creator, the unity of God, the oneness of God. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. This was not something that inherently had to be part of Kriyas HaTorah. It wasn't something that inherently had to be part of Musaf, because it's not part of Kriyas HaTorah or Musaf. But the Jews interjected it in those two places. They interjected it so that publicly, even though they fulfilled the technical mitzvah in their homes before they came to shul, publicly they could declare the oneness of God's name. We're long past the time of Byzantine Christians. There's no longer sentries and guards posted in our Shacharis services on a Shabbos or on a Yom Tov. Why are we still saying Shema when we take out the Torah? Why are we still saying the Shema interpolated into the Musaf Kedusha? For this very reason. For the reason that the Avudorim develops as to why we still say the Haftarah. Because what? What are we saying essentially? We're expressing our eternal gratitude to these Jews who kept the principles of Jewish theology, who kept the principles of the true knowledge of the Creator, something that could be declared, something that could be taught, something that could be define how we go about our existence. Instead of it being squelched, and even though it's no longer squelched because we're no longer under the tyrannical oppression of the Byzantine Christians, we historically look back. In every Shabbos, in every Yom Tov, we declare Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Where? In a place where it normally wouldn't be found, is our expression of Hakaras HaTov, of gratitude for their Mesiras Nefesh, for the Mesiras Nefesh that they engaged in to keep that principle alive, dynamic, and well. Because after all, many of you are familiar from Rabbeinu Bachya, the famous philosophical work, Chovas HaLevavos, the duties of the heart. It was a forerunner to the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim. The Rambam held from that great work. What does Rabbeinu Bachya say in the Chovas HaLevavos? The Rav used to quote this. That what is the sine qua non of being a Jew? What is the underpinning of being a Jew? You know what it is? The underpinning of being a Jew is homogratitudinous. Being a profoundly grateful, a profoundly appreciative person of all that someone has done for us, that the Almighty has done for us, that our parents have done for us, that historically our ancestors have done for us, our employers. What defines and what demarcates a Jew is not just someone who says thank you, not just someone who's appreciative, but a profound sense of gratitude. Hakaras HaTov, Hakaras HaTov. That's the bumper sticker, that's the hallmark, the benchmark of any Jew. And what do? We express our Hakaras HaTov to those who kept Jewish theology under the worst of times, those who committed themselves to the principles of the Masorah under the worst of times. We stand up and express our Hakaras HaTov, even though it's not necessary for us to say Shema at that point. Nevertheless, that's what we're doing. And then the third example, the third and final example of this, is there something that we all grapple with, we don't understand it. Kedusha de Sidra. What's Kedusha de Sidra? Here it is, it's the end of davening. You've already finished the Amidah. If it's a Monday or Thursday, you've already read the Torah. And now we're finishing up the davening. And in this Uvalat Zion, all of a sudden they interpolated Kedusha. But not just a Kedusha with the Targum Onkelos, with the translation which is an explanation. When we say Kedusha, normally we just say it in Hebrew. We don't give a translation which is an explanation. And what do we need to do it? It's the end of davening. Davar Kedusha is, I understand what it's doing in the Amidah. What's it doing at the end of davening? So the same idea. Eventually, the oppression and tyranny of the Byzantine Christians got even worse. Not only did they prohibit us saying Shema, but then at a later stage, they prohibited us from saying Kedusha. What's wrong with Kedusha? The famous verse from Yeshaya, from Isaiah the prophet. Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzivakos, Meloch Haaretz Kvodo. Why does it say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh 3 times? So what did the Christians claim? That is a proof to the Trinity. It says it 3 times. Because really, it's not one God, chas v'shalom. The heresy of the Christianity, it's not one God. There are 3 components that make up one. And that's why you have to say Kadosh 3 times. What is that? Where does that come from? Because the nevuos, the prophecies of Yeshaya, of Isaiah, which when we study the Sefer Yeshaya, many of them are ahistorical nevuos, right? Why is it that the Christians always use the prophecies from the end of Isaiah as a proof to the carpenter of Nazareth, to the Messiah? Because they were ahistorical. So once something is ahistorical, you can make it say whatever you want it to say. You can make it fit into whatever you want it to fit, because it's not in a context of a certain time and place in history. So they took something from earlier in the work of Yeshaya, and they wanted to show this is a proof to the Trinity. What did they attack? They attack something that is so fundamentally Jewish. Just like the last time we spoke about Shema, here they take something that's so fundamentally Jewish, the verse of Kedusha, and they twist it and pervert it. Let me give you an example. I just wanted something, many of you have been to Prague. Anyone who's, you're familiar with the Charles Bridge. I believe it's the river is either the Danube or the Dnieper River. The Charles Bridge goes over the Danube. And what do you see there? And as a Jew, you cringe. In gold is a crucifix with the Hebrew pasuk from Yeshaya, from Isaiah, Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzvakos, Meloch Haaretz Kvodo. What's the story behind that famous post over the bridge? They forced the Jewish people to give up their gold. From an artistic point of view, it's a very significant work. And what did they do? It took a lot of gold to make that. And in gold letters and a gold crucifix, this was the punishment for the Jews, that they were going to force them to do this, because everyone crossed that bridge. For commerce purposes, you'd cross from one side of the river to the other. And it was like a pachin punim, a slap in the face to the Jews, that they'd have to cross the bridge and see this all the time. So what is Kadosh Kadosh? What is it? What is Kedusha? Kedusha, and we'll spend just a minute, it requires a lot more than this, but it's this dialectic between God's immanence, Melo Chol Haaretz Kvodo. God, in other words, you can perceive God throughout the physical universe. He's apparent. Hashem Tzvakos. Where do you find God? In every aspect of nature, in every aspect of the world. Melo Chol Haaretz. He fills the universe. That's on the one hand. Who was saying that? Yeshaya. Isaiah, during the time of the Beis HaMikdash, during a time when you could perceive the presence of God in a clear, manifest way. But then what do we say? We quote Yechezkel. Yechezkel Hanavi is in a concentration camp. He's a refugee on the Kfar tributary. It's a tributary off of the Euphrates River. And it's not so clear, and it's not so apparent. And the Jews are broken, and they're hurt. And he says, Baruch Kavod Hashem mimakomo. Sometimes God is transcendent. Sometimes we perceive God. God is immanent. Melo Chol Haaretz Kvodo. And sometimes God is transcendent. Baruch Kavod Hashem mimakomo, from his place. This is the theme of Kedusha. But God's control of the universe, God's, so to speak, defining the universe, both on a physical level, on a moral level, on a metaphysical level. Yimloch Hashem la'olam, Elokai tzion l'dor v'ador haliyah. That God being the master of the universe, that's something that is an eternal definition. So those are the 3 themes of Kedusha. But what did they do? They perverted that first theme. So what happened They prohibited Jews from saying Kedusha. We couldn't have a Chazaras Hashatz that included Kedusha. What did the Jews do? After the centuries left, after the Amidah, right? The Amidah was over, the Jews couldn't say their Kedusha. At the end of davening, they created something called Kedusha de Sidra. They didn't just say the Kedusha in Uva L'Tzion, they translated it. Why did they translate it? So that it should not be corrupted. It should not be perverted. I'm quoting on 154 of the Art Scroll Siddur. What's the Kadosh Kadosh? There are three ideas. First Kadosh, Miroma I Allah Beishchinte. Where is God? God is in the heavens, in the cosmos. He is master of the complete universe. Kadish al Ara Ovad Gevurte. Where is God? Unique and distinct on this earth. Not just in the cosmos, but running this earth, the earth that you and I, the Homo sapien, that humanity lives in. And what's the third Kadosh? Kadosh Lalam Olmei Almaya. If the first two are talking about space, the third is talking about time. God's uniqueness, God being that special, unique creator, sustainer, is not only in the realm of space, be it the earth that we live on, but the complete cosmos, but it's also in terms of time. God precedes time, God is after time. As you know from Einstein, time is contingent upon matter. God controls he's in the past, the present, the future. So this was the idea of why Yeshaya said 3 times Kadosh, as we translate and as we spell out in the Siddur. They instituted this so that the Jews would always have this semblance of Kedusha, always a semblance of what the Kedusha is and what it means and what we are acknowledging before our Master, before our Sustainer, before our Maker. That we historically express our gratitude. We historically stand up and we pay tribute to the Mesiras Nefesh they had to these principles. That these principles should not be obliterated, that they should not be perverted and manipulated and corrupted. And we historically stand up, even though it's not necessary. Again, we're not under the tyranny or the oppression of the Byzantine Christians anymore. Afal Pikein, nevertheless, what do? We still say that Kedusha de Sidra at the end of davening to express our historical gratitude to the Jews of that time, whose Mesiras Nefesh enabled these principles to continue throughout Jewish history. Thank you.